All of the great civilizations that sprang from the Nile were also located on the continent of Africa. The saga you are about to witness will take you back to the ancient Nile, to Nubia and Egypt, the first great nations on earth. It is a summary of that faraway, now almost forgotten, golden age in the history of black people. It was a time when black pharaohs and queens did indeed rule the civilized world of their day, and the achievements of these ancient people have had an important impact on modern society. Let us now turn to part one of the Clegg series, Egypt during the Golden Age. The Nile River, rising out of the interior of Africa, rushes down the mountains on its journey to the Mediterranean Sea. On its way, it carries precious fertile earth, which it deposits on its banks. For a few miles on each side of the Nile, there is a green belt that quickly melts into the surrounding desert. About 10,000 years ago, people began migrating toward the Nile and ultimately drifting into and settling its fruitful plain. An ancient and proud people who would build a great civilization, who would create an empire that would extend into the interior of Africa, engulf Asia Minor, embrace the Middle East, and influence the entire Mediterranean world. These ancient people would build monuments of great magnitude and splendor, monuments that would be the envy of the ancient world, monuments that would serve as the blueprint and foundation for modern civilization. They also invented law and mathematics, science, writing, music, and agriculture. Who were these people? Where did they come from? Strong evidence indicates that they came from the south, from a country through which the Nile flows, from the land of Nubia, or what we call the northern Sudan in Africa. It was only natural for ancient explorers to follow the Nile River in order to find where it was going, and in doing that, to settle along its banks and to ultimately found a great and thriving civilization. The Nubians of antiquity stated that Egypt was a colony of their land, and that the Egyptians derived their laws and customs from their Nubian cousins to the south. A number of scholars hold this opinion today.
The pharaonic civilization that later came to characterize ancient Egypt had already existed in what we call Nubia for at least 300 years before the first dynasty. Now, as far as I'm concerned, Egypt and Nubia were part of the same cultural complex. There was no essential cultural, linguistic, ethnic, or racial difference between them. The differences, such as they were in the manner of regional differences, much as the difference you might find in England between, say, an Englishman and a Welshman, in the Central Europe between a German and an Austrian, in Italy between an Italian, for example, and a Sicilian. So even though these are regional variations, if you will, they still belong to the same general civilization complex. So did Egypt and Nubia, and the Egyptians themselves said so. They themselves knew that their civilization derived from the southern part of their, south of their borders, and they knew that it derived from what we call Nubia, or Ethiopia. So civilization itself descends the Nile from Inner Africa. If you will, it crystallizes in Nubia, and then reaches its highest and final form in the land called Kemet, or ancient Egypt, over a period of 4,000 years of unbroken Egyptian civilization.
Modern evidence appears to confirm the tradition that civilization traveled northward from Nubia into Egypt. Skulls and skeletons unearthed in Nubia and Egypt are of the same or similar African racial type. Some of the most ancient paintings and drawings of Nubians and Egyptians also depict them as a distinctly African people. As Dr. Finch has noted, Egypt's general political structure and divine kingship appear to have been modeled after the Tasseti dynasty of Nubia that preceded that of Egypt by over 200 years. In other words, there were pharaohs ruling Nubia long before Egypt became a nation. Some scientists insist that pyramid building also began in Nubia and was refined and perfected after the Nubians moved northward and settled in Egypt. Even mummification appears to have started in Nubia and to have spread northward into Egypt 500 years after it was invented. Nubia was also considered the land of the gods and the spiritual home of the Egyptian people. Perhaps that is why the chief beneficent gods and goddesses of Egypt, such as Osiris and Isis, were depicted as blacks. Finally, during all of her periods of upheaval, chaos, and foreign invasions, Egypt was rescued and reunited by powerful black men from the Nubian south. This was true of the Mentuhoteps in the Middle Kingdom. It was true of Ahmose I in the New Kingdom, and it was true of Pianki and Taharqa during the 25th dynasty. Although not all scientists and scholars agree, the weight of evidence certainly points toward a black origin of Egyptian civilization. In time, of course, Asians and Europeans settled Lower Egypt near the Mediterranean Sea and ultimately intermingled with the native black population. Nevertheless, Egypt's cultural, physical, and spiritual legacy was chiefly derived from the black Nubian South. This no doubt explains why, in later years, the visiting Hebrews, Greeks, Romans, and others described the ancient Egyptians as black-skinned with close curled hair. The distinguished writer, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, captured the opinions of the ancients when he wrote, "We conclude, therefore, that the Egyptians were Negroid, and not only that, but by tradition they believed themselves descended, not from the whites or the yellows, but from the black people of the South. Thence they traced their origin, and toward the South in earlier days, they turned the faces of their buried corpses." Du Bois might also have added that the Egyptians themselves called their country Kemet, which many scholars interpret as land of the blacks. Now that we've learned about the origin of these ancient people, let us see how Egypt became a great African nation. Because of the surrounding desert, Egypt was shielded from invasion for thousands of years. During that time, various people who occupied the Nile Valley began working together. The Nile overflowed its banks every year. Controlling the river was important if the people wanted to grow food successfully. The Egyptians first formed villages that cooperated with each other. Cooperation led to organization, and organization led to the building of a great nation. A little over 5,000 years ago, another important step took place. At that time, the nation was divided into two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt. A black man, Narmer, united the two lands into one. This followed a war in which Narmer's troops defeated Asian immigrants who had settled in Lower Egypt. Narmer became the first pharaoh or king of Egypt, following the great kings of Ta-Seti in Nubia. This pharaoh began the rule of what is called the Dynasty, which is a line of kings and queens of the same family. Narmer had a glorious reign of 62 years. One of his greatest achievements was diverting the Nile River and creating the delta where he built the city of Memphis. This was the beginning of Egypt's golden age. Little is known of the pharaohs who followed Narmer during the first and second dynasties. Some of them, such as King Kasakam and King Paa-Neneter, appear to have been stern and powerful men. During the reigns of these pharaohs, Egyptian society evolved into classes. First, there were the peasants or laborers. Then came the builders, artists, jewelers, and other skilled workers. After them were the warriors, priests, and officials. Finally, there was the pharaoh or king. The women of Egypt were also an integral part of the society. Many of them engaged in the same labor that men did, and they had equal opportunity to own, manage, and receive property. There were also many prominent women in ancient Egypt, some of whom reigned during the Golden Age.